So first off, welcome back to our diverse webinar series. We haven't had one of these in quite a while, so we're really happy to have you all here. Before I get started, because I'm based at the University of Alberta, I'm going to start off with a land acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So the University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the territory of the Nahia, Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis people. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So our speaker for today is Phil Burton. He's a plant ecologist, disturbance ecologist, and silvicultural researcher. He's currently an emeritus professor at the University of Northern British Columbia and is a former research manager with the Canadian Forest Service. Along with more than 120 scientific articles and book chapters, he has several books to his name, including the most recent, Resilient Forest Management, published by Oxford University Press in 2025. And before Phil gets started, Christian is just going to share a couple words, and then Phil will take it from there.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I just wanted to say that it was such a great pleasure to have you, Phil, join this webinar series. For some of you that maybe don't know me and Phil, we've known each other almost for 40 years now. I was at UBC in 1989 when he came and did a very nice interview. I don't know if you remember, Phil, but I was impressed by the confidence and I would say the gentleness that you showed during this interview. And I thought these were two traits that I wanted to emulate. So I have tried to emulate that throughout my career. I will stop there, but I will maybe say that I was fortunate enough, and I did the count this morning, Phil, that we did work on a few papers and a few books. I had listed 7 of them over our career. So I will let you start your presentation. Thank you, Phil, for being with us today.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Catherine. Christian, we will end on maybe that same note of gentleness and humility at the end of this presentation too. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and once again, apologies for the connection issues. I'm speaking to you today from my daughter's house, actually, in Smithers, BC. So this is the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, the inhabitants of the Bulkley Valley since time immemorial. And it's a pleasure to speak to you about a topic that has ended up being a unifying one throughout the last perhaps decade of my career, and one which I share with Christian and owe a lot of credit to him for raising my consciousness of. But we'll get into that discussion perhaps after the presentation. So the first issue perhaps is, how do I advance my slides? Here we go. So let me first give you a definition, a framework by what I mean by resilience, which is not the way everybody uses it. I really focus on the end result, which is that it's the maintenance of system functionality and the persistence of the system, or at least its ecosystem values when talking about ecological systems. So it really is a gradient of options, some of which allow a system, whether we're talking about an ecosystem, but even also a social system, to resist change, to absorb that change, to recover from that change in the face of minor disruptions, or if really knocked on its heels, it'll take a longer time to recover. Or in the process of recovering, it may adjust and reconfigure itself, or sometimes even transform itself so that not all of the original components or values are there, but some of them are. So we have this wide range of resilience mechanisms. And it's perhaps useful to think of them in terms of metaphors. So I use the idea of a coil spring as the ability to rebound, to recover immediately to what it was before. A granite massif is very resistant to change at all, except over very long periods of time. A crescent wrench is an adjustable tool, so we can think of adjustments, small changes, or more wholesale changes. For example, filling in a window with bricks so that you still keep out the outside elements, but now you can't see anymore. So there's some values that are retained, others that are not. And in terms of transformation, perhaps the best example comes from the biological world. The herbivorous larva of lepidopterans, butterflies, and moths changes into a sexually active flying adult. So that's a transformation in form, but built on the existing one single genetic blueprint. So let's talk about adaptive traits in trees and forests. We can think of many ways in which plants, as well as animals, fungi, and bacteria, are adapted to the environment and different environments around this earth. As we're facing with a changing climate and greater disturbances, we might look at resistance to and recovery from wildfire. So resistance to fire is epitomized by the thick bark of a mature ponderosa pine or Douglas fir tree on the left there. We can also think of self-pruning that allows branches to be very high out of the reach of surface fires. But a lot of the adaptations have to do with recovery from fire. So we're all familiar with the serotinous cones of jack pines and lodgepole pines, the semi-serotinous cones of black spruce that allow rapid colonization of the burnt substrate after fire. Similarly, the sprouts from subsurface runners in aspen can quickly colonize an area, often far distances from where you think the mother tree was. And perhaps we're less familiar with some adaptations in other ecosystems, such as the ability of many eucalyptus trees in Australia to actually resprout from the stem with new foliage. Similarly, in some fire-adapted pines in northern Africa and the Canary Islands. The bottom right photo shows lignotubers, very large masses of active meristems that allow some Australian and Mediterranean trees and shrubs to regrow after fire. And of course, there are traits throughout the ecosystem, just looking at some of the other plants, the herbaceous species that can recover from rhizomes or root crowns below the surface. They can spread in by rapid dispersal of wind-borne seeds. There are some fire-adapted, fire specialist species, such as in the lower right, the geranium, or Corydalis species. And we're learning more and more that many of the fungal species, especially the ascomycetes, it turns out, like the morels everyone likes to forage for after fires, play a very important role in ecosystem recovery after wildfires. So that's just a taste of one nest of adaptations in the plant world, which if we tried to characterize the many different growth forms, statures, whether foliage is deciduous or evergreen, differences in growth rate and wood density, shade tolerance, salt tolerance, flood tolerance, dispersal strategies, resistance to herbivores, nitrogen fixation, all of these things in the plant world are so diverse and adapted to particular environments, particular disturbances or disturbance regimes, and different places on the earth. So just looking at one set of functional traits, we might look at, again, those that position us for persisting or adjusting, adapting to being resilient in a warming climate. So faced with higher temperatures, more drought and fire, a lot of them provide resistance, ability to stay where the existing species and plant communities are in terms of greater drought tolerance, being able to survive fires or reproduce after it, the column on the left. But those that allow the ability to adapt and to move, since plants can't pick up and move, they're dependent on their seeds and pollen moving. They're dependent on genetic variation to sift through the possibilities of staying or moving elsewhere as the environment changes around them. And many adaptations involve trade-offs. You often can't be good at both resistance and recovery. This particular graph shows a trade-off between the increase in ring width after droughts and the resistance to any loss of tree ring growth during droughts. So this was based on a meta-analysis of tree ring studies from around the world. And this is but one of many trade-offs or contradictions, you might say, in resilient strategies, where we face the same thing at the landscape level, where we want both modularity, the ability to isolate forest stands from threats, but we also want connectivity to allow biodiversity to move and migrate through the landscape. So speaking of migration, let's remember that most of Canada was covered in ice sheets 20,000 years ago, and the forest came back, right? So there's tremendous inherent resilience, ability to survive climate change and recover after it without our intervention. But that took 10,000 or more years. So now we're faced with the fragmented landscape, the land chewed up for agriculture and highways and all of our other human footprint, so that we're speaking more in terms of assisted migration, at least for trees and perhaps some targeted rare species, whether it's moving provenances, just populations around within a species in the lower left of the cartoon on the right, or whether we're talking about range expansions. For example, in BC, we are moving Douglas fir and western larch into parts of north central BC where they had not historically been growing. Or we can talk about what we would generally call introducing exotic species across a natural barrier of oceans, because we're looking for certain traits such as adaptation to the new climate regime or preferred wood production and so forth. So there are lots of options, a range of scenarios, and again, a gradient of treatments we might explore in trying to facilitate that migration, that adaptation to a new climate. But again and again, as is the theme of the diverse network, the key, the raw material for all this resilience is diversity. So this bar chart shows some before and after species abundances at a forest in Virginia, with the before chestnut blight arrived in the 1930s, it was dominated by American chestnut. And then some 60 years later, we see the chestnut is all gone, and we have other things taking its place. So there was still a closed canopy forest of red oak and red maple and other species. And in fact, it looks like there is a greater representation of other species there. We can look at other examples in terms of planning for change. Again, thinking of climate change as the driving issue here, whereby opting for a wide niche breadth, a wide adaptability of performance is perhaps more prudent than optimizing either under current conditions or the future conditions. And so the bottom line here is that with enough genetic or species diversity within or among species, that is, there will be something to take advantage of future conditions and unforeseen conditions. And in the big picture, let's just step back and take a look at the whole tree of life. Okay, today we still have more than 400,000 plant species, millions of insect species, and so on. And each one of them, we have to have the respect for the fact that each species is a unique, represents a unique resilient strategy. And just as Aldo Leopold says, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the pieces. We never want to lose a species for that unique story it has to tell. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to walk through a few examples of some studies of disturbance and recovery in northern BC forests that my students and I have undertaken over the last 10 years. As mentioned in the introduction, I consider myself more of a ecologist interested in vegetation dynamics through both disturbance and through succession or recovery, more so than a forester. But it turns out that those traits, that interest, has relevance to things like silviculture and ecological restoration. And I'll highlight some of those applications as we go along. So the first of, I think, it's 6 examples I'll explore with you. There was a western hemlock looper outbreak, a defoliator of hemlock and cedar trees in the Upper Fraser and Robson Valley of central BC in the 90s. My master's student, Michelle Connolly, sampled that about 20 years later, focusing on the plant communities that she found there. And whereas originally there were what I saw as 3 trajectories of successional recovery, one, a outgrowth of an explosion really of nitrogen-loving shrubs in response to all that frost raining down from the defoliator. Then there was clusters of conifer regeneration, and there were spots that were either mossy or fern dominated. But it turns out that those trajectories did not maintain themselves over 2 decades, and instead the plant communities showed amazing affinity to what mature climax forests should have for those particular site types, those site series or ecotypes. So the plant community was actually unexpectedly resilient, even in the face of this disturbance and open sunlight, to its original composition. It bounced back. Second example, the mountain pine beetle outbreak of Western Canada, which many of you may have heard of or experienced. Here's on the left one of the many examples of the red map of death, explaining that 18 million hectares were affected by the mountain pine beetle in British Columbia alone. But as I and my students again and again tried to convey, not all of that area is pure lodgepole pine. So the resilience in terms of both resistance and recovery can be seen in terms of what we called secondary structure, anything that was not susceptible to mountain pine beetle attack. So that includes all the aspen and spruce and fir and Douglas fir trees that are intermixed with lodgepole pine trees. So in fact, 80% of that area, was not dead forest. It just had some loss of the lodgepole pine. And sometimes you have to document what is obvious. So here in a couple of 100 plots, we demonstrated that the remaining living basal area was in direct proportion to the number of non-pine species found there. So what happens after the beetle kills the overstory, especially in these pine-dominated stands? Well, the historical norm had been wildfires. You have a lot of dead wood, whether the fire spreads with erratic behavior during the red dead phase of foliage, or whether the trees fall down and have an intense burn on the ground. And the serotinous cones of the pine quite like that, and we have a new pine forest again. But there are also areas that do not burn. And we have tried to map and model those and demonstrated that, again, something like 1/3 to 1/2 of the forests have really well-developed understories of advanced regeneration of spruce and fir trees. And from areas that had passed mountain pine beetle outbreaks, we know that they develop into quite nice complex stands of those species in the future. And yet there are other areas that are just moss dominated. When they do fall down, they may not succeed to forest right away. And those are the ones that we recommended should be targeted for salvage logging. So much of the central BC ended up being subject to 500-hectare clear cuts, in which, of course, they took a lot of the bycatch, as we might call it, of spruce and other species as well. Now, in both the forest fire case and in the salvage logging case where it's planted to pine again, if it was 100% pine, they typically planted pine again. Are we setting this up for what we called in a bioscience paper a disturbance loop? We're just setting it up to another outbreak. The alternative, of course, is to leave those stands with good secondary structure to recover and develop on their own. Now, this also provided an opportunity to look at fire, where I wanted to not just sample what happened after wildfires, but get in there before the fire to sample what was there, because we know the resilient strategy of so many plants, both herbaceous and shrubby ones, is to recover from rhizomes or underground growing points. So I wanted to know that abundance ahead of time. So I worked on 3 different prescribed fire programs in which we could get in there and get those measurements ahead of time. One south of Vanderhoof, one in Mount Robson Provincial Park, and one in Jasper National Park. Some of that's been published. The data has all been archived with help from a CIE data intern, but yeah, I still have to write up a couple of those papers. But here's the results from the Carrot Lake south of Vanderhoof study. 5 years later, we see increased growth of a couple of the vaccinium species, those blueberry species. And that agrees well with the traditional knowledge of Indigenous people that burning enhances the production of berry bushes. And in contrast, we see a loss of the feather moss, the Pleurozium schreiberi, which without burning was only deteriorating at something like 3% a year. And colleagues have identified that as like a major limitation to natural new conifer recruitment if it doesn't get burned or removed or treated somehow. So moving on from wildfire recovery to wildfire resistance, BC had several very large fires, greater than 10,000 hectares each in 2017, 2018, then again in 2021 and 2023. And satellite mapping shows this sort of variation in burn severity, where the yellow is low burn severity, orange intermediate, light green moderate, dark green basically unburned. Red is heavy burn severity. And we specifically looked at a couple of questions there. I won't get into the plantation issue, but we also looked at broadleaf dominated stands. Are they more fire resistant? There's certainly the perception out there that because aspen stands in particular, but broadleafs in general, have a higher foliar moisture content, often about 130% of dry weight, even during drought conditions, compared to conifers, which are only 80 to 100%. They should not burn as well. Often they are shade intolerant, so they have their crowns much higher from the ground. And we did find evidence in the fires. I think there were 22 we evaluated altogether. Those that had broadleafs, 5 of them did have burn severities less than the percent burned in the fire as a whole. But contrary to expectations, 3 of them burned more severely. And this has been a subject of recurrent interest, and we see 2 patterns emerging as to when broadleaf stands are more resistant or less resistant to fire. Spring fires with grassy understories with human ignition seems to be one explanation. Another explanation seems to be in very old aspen stands. Once they break up and the fallen stems become jackstrawed all over the place, then you can get very intense burns as well. In general, we found evidence that broadleaf dominated stands reduced burn severity as well as being less susceptible to fire, but sort of only at that 5% level, difficult to count on. More about fire recovery. This is the work of Alana Clayson, who looked at a chronosequence of stands in north central BC that after fire had been replanted or not. And after about 50 years, they end up having about the same trajectory of carbon recovery. And what this says to me is that the natural ingress of trees in our area through those serotinous cones, through the in-seeding from surviving trees, does quite well in terms of reforesting a site. And there are lots of different ways that forest ecosystems can come back. This is some work of John Parmenter in northeastern BC, plotting many different pathways of succession. Other disturbances, they're not necessarily natural disturbances, or not necessarily logging or industrial. Even recreation has its impacts. Here is an old growth reserve that was a provincial park that had also had camping pads on it. Your typical BC parks campsite in which you're supposed to roll up with your RV and camp there for a while, so it's very compacted. Fortunately, they had let me back up. A danger tree assessment found out that there was something like a third of the trees were in danger of falling on the campsites. So fortunately, they decided to close the campground instead of removing the danger trees in what was the old growth reserve. So here's what it looked like in 2002. They then stopped the campsite use, did shallow ripping just with an excavator bucket, the teeth of the bucket to loosen up the soil. And some 20 years later, it's completely dominated by red alder and elderberry and hemlock seedlings, a few cedar and spruce seedlings. So, you know, the natural recovery, and you see this on old logging roads throughout the coastal forest, does quite well without our intervention. And that's not always the case. If you have compacted soils far from seed sources, they can remain bare for a long time. Here's another example, a unique opportunity to study ecosystem development after a volcanic eruption. So it was a single eruption about 300 years ago in the Nass Valley, left a lava plain of some 4,000 hectares. And most of it looks like this, just bare expanses of stereocolon lichen and Rhacometrium moss. But some areas on the same lava substrate are completely forested with deciduous, mixedwood, and conifer forests. And some of that reflects an edge effect, decreasing amounts of vascular cover as you get away from the adjacent forest. But more important has been its post-volcanic disturbance regime. We found evidence and mapped documentation of some 5 or 6 wildfires on the lava beds. Many of them probably started by humans because it's an area of heavy human activity. And that kept knocking back the natural succession happening on much of the study area. But at the same time, there are occasional floods. And with those floods come a silt deposition, which was responsible for the establishment of cohorts of lodgepole pine or occasional establishment by spruce and cottonwood. So just summarizing a few lessons there. Most forests can resist, recover from, or adjust to disturbances quite well, but it takes time and is very context specific. If I am to undertake another book, I think I'm going to call it The Ecology of Place, how context and space and time determine so much about how ecosystems develop and persist. And the other thing, of course, from a management perspective is that recovery or persistence may not be with the species or values, the ecosystem services that we want. So in managing them and nudging them, we should take our cues from nature, promote and take advantage of differences in wildfire or pest resistance, accepting what a site wants to grow in terms of the dominant species and allowing that multi-species stands to develop because they provide a degree of insurance, of bet hedging. recognizing the different regeneration strategies, site affinities, and tolerances. We should also recognize that some forms of disturbance really are degrading, more damaging, and long-lasting, and there are lots of opportunities where we do want to intervene in terms of restoration. If there's been soil loss or soil sterilization, all the life burned out of it, or compaction. Invasive exotic species can be a real challenge that changes the trajectory in a way that we don't want. And short interval disturbances, such as in severe wildfires or short rotation clear cuts, can really be decimating too and would benefit from restoration. Finally, we might say expect the unexpected. In Western indigenous cultures, whether it's on the plains or the West Coast, there's the tradition of the coyote or the raven as a trickster, always there to disrupt your plans and to keep you humble. Let's remember that there are many pathways of ecological resistance and many possible solutions to any problem. And another reality check, not all forests are resilient to all disturbances. So this picture here is of the Williston Reservoir drawdown zone. So that used to be a boreal forest, but if it's under 8 to 10 meters of water for most of August through the winter months, no terrestrial plants can grow there. Then it's exposed as the water is drawn down for power generation over the winter. And at least in this part of the world, it had a sandy base to the forest floor, and all of the organic matter has since decomposed after 50 years, and it's like a desert. And there's really no revegetation prescription that will work here. There's no natural recovery except for around the edges, which gets the water levels fluctuate from year to year. But because there's no natural precedent for a hydroelectric reservoir, there are no species adapted to this disturbance regime. So in the big picture, let's remember that global change isn't just about atmospheric warming and disturbances, especially when it comes to the forest sector. We're dealing with all sorts of technological developments. We're dealing with different market demands and barriers around the world. Increased globalization means that we have to deal with exotic species, and the public changes its mind from time to time as to what it wants from forests. So the direction going forward in terms of forest management is to maintain your diversity, your flexibility, your reserves, connectivity, and to just be humble, to realize that we're not really in charge. We're not managing or controlling things as much as we want. So this is a recurrent theme in my book here, how to transition from a command and control management with, choosing one thing to optimize everywhere to a more holistic ecological stewardship. It really is a call for ecoforestry, ecological forestry, taking our cue from nature, keeping options open, facilitating and nudging that inherent resilience of trees and forest ecosystems. And if you're interested, you can go online at the Oxford University Press website and see just full table of contents and chapter abstracts there, give you the main ideas of each of the 12 chapters. It's available on Google Play and at ecoms.book and in hardcover from your usual book vendors. And I think that's all I have to say in a one-way presentation, and we move on to maybe a bit of a discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Phil, for your presentation and for sharing a bit of your work with us. So yeah, we're open for questions. I know Christian's also here to kind of facilitate discussion too. So maybe Christian, I'll let you start it off. And for those of you that have questions, you can raise your hand and we'll let you speak, or you can put it in the chat.
I just want to add to this. I have the book. I've read it. It's a very good book. I think everybody should get the book. It has lots of good information and ideas. All right.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Phil. I have so many questions, and that means we will need to get together for a beer or a supper to discuss this. But I will start with a difficult question, maybe, that I am facing almost every day, and that is maybe creating some disagreement among a lot of us forest ecologists, is where is the place of ecosystem management in a resilient forest management under global change? If I look at the way we developed it, and you were involved in the Sustainable Forest Management Network, a lot of it was to base forest management on historical range of variability or the natural range of variability. Is it still an option today? I will ask this for you and to maintain the resilience of our our forest.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's one that plagues the restoration community as well. The folks involved with ecosystem restoration take their template from the past. We want to put it back the way it was before. And I think there's general agreement that one can't do that, and we're facing a trajectory of change. So I think the concept that we borrow from the past in terms of natural ranges of variability from which ecosystems can recover and achieve some kind of dynamic equilibrium is the useful concept, but we now have to move it forward into the anticipated climate environment and anticipated climate envelope. And the way many people are doing that is by looking for climate analogs. Okay, so if we are in, let's say, northern Alberta, and we're looking for climate analogs for what the forest there might be like in 70 years at the end of the next rotation, we might have to look to southern Alberta for examples. If we are in British Columbia, we might have to look to Oregon. If we are in Quebec, we might have to look to New York State. So there are examples there of species that thrive under the temperature and precipitation regime that we see there. The disturbance regime will be a little more difficult to match because it depends so much on landscape configurations and other factors. But at least for climate, I think we can find those examples, those guidelines.
That's a very good compromise, I think, Phil. I recognize you there. So, Catherine, do you want me to ask another question, or there is already enough questions and people want to join the discussion?
Yeah, we have a few questions started. So first off, I see Dan Nisha, you have your hand up, so you should be able to unmute now and ask your question and join the discussion.
A former student of yours, Phil, right?
Yes. Dan did his master's with me at UBC.
Dan, can you speak?
I'm wondering if
We
Dan
don't
is
hear
having
you.
issues with his microphone because I'm seeing he has unmuted. So
All
Dan,
right.
give you a moment, but
Maybe another quick question, another one. I mean, I have so many things that I'm struggling with, but with a lot of the prediction of climate change, there is some prediction that some of our forests might move from the forest to prairies,
Yes.
and vice versa. Some of the tundra might move toward a forest, which will drastically change the biodiversity that is there and will change a lot of the interaction. So is this something that we should let happen, or should we fight it to try to keep the system as it is today?
Yes, another interesting question that people are wrestling with. I mean, it even comes to the issue of whether a full biome type transformation is just giving up. Does that mean everything else has failed, right? But I think, again, we have to look at two things. What is the future climate envelope and its disturbance regime? But also, what do people want? Okay, so in some parts of central British Columbia, for example, there have been some very large fires. I mean, half 500,000 hectares in the Plateau complex, much of it burning through plantations as well as through primary forest. But it's an area that also has a very active and vocal ranching community. And they're saying, look, we're expecting more fires in the future. Maybe some of the projections are fire return intervals of 30 years, which is not enough to develop a commercial tree crop. Let's just leave it and we will graze cattle on it for the foreseeable future. Or maybe they would even encourage range seeding. So I think we can't divorce ourselves from the land use context and the values that people want. There's other arguments saying that let's beware of saying we should plant trees everywhere. This should not be at the detriment of natural tundra and grasslands, which have their own species, many of which are endangered as well. And there's some interesting research coming together that suggests that the Pleistocene megafauna actually kept our forests much more open than we're used to today. So, patches of more grassland at our forest edges is perhaps the healthy way to let the experiment play out. Are the trees doing better? Or are the meadow species doing better?
Okay, Catherine, I'll let you maybe let people ask questions. Maybe Dan, if you can, or other people.
I can take some questions from the comments, and I think Dan's still having issues with his mic. So I just scrolled back to the first one we got from Julie Messier. Would it be reasonable to conclude that if broadleaves are more resistant and conifers are more resilient, we need forests that contain both broadleaves to reduce its risk of burning, and some conifers because they have adaptations to recover from the fires? She's asking because broadleaves are not adapted to recover from fires as far as she knows, so a broadleaf stand wouldn't recover well from a fire, correct?
Well, again, everything is so species specific, even birch trees will often resprout from a stump, and the ability to resprout of many hardwood species depends on their size and their age. And of course, the example of aspen coming up from not from runners, but underground stems, shows that they are resilient to fire as well. But to your broader question, I think there are so many reasons for encouraging mixed forests, whether it's to break up the dispersal distances between pests, or whether it's to encourage more wildlife like songbirds, and also to maintain a reservoir of the parasites that control the pests, such as spruce budworm. There are many advantages to having mixed stands. The exact proportion of broadleaves that will provide wildfire resistance is an area of ongoing research. Many people are interested in that question as they try and develop prescriptions around the wildland-urban interface of communities. So that's a topic that's probably, again, very place-specific and species-specific to know how much safety do you buy by adding more broadleaves.
And Catherine, I see that Dan has written a question. I could read it, or maybe you want me to read it?
Sure, go for it.
All right. Phil, a former student of yours, he has two questions. He says, naturally, there are many forests dominated by single or a few species, yet a message you mentioned a few times is diversity is a way of attaining resilience. Is this hedging bets rather than resilience?
Well, it's like I said at the outset, there are many ways of achieving resilience. I would include bet hedging as part of that strategy for achieving resilience. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
whether
whether it confers a functional difference versus just a empirical risk reduction doesn't matter in the end.
And maybe another quick question. He says, following up on climate analogs, I think it was in response to my question, a nice positive message, but what about soil? How much are we
Yeah.
just kidding ourselves with thinking that soils are analog if you move from central United States to northern Quebec? I added this. That was not part of the question.
Yep. Yep. No, many people are considering that issue now too. And the same is true about the idea of will forests just easily expand into tundra or grasslands into forest. I mean, the soil biota of those systems is so different at bacterial, protozoan, and at fungal levels that there could be huge lags related to the soil catching up. And at least in the realm of restoration, there's been great success at simply inoculating soils on heavily degraded sites with intact, a tablespoonful of soil from a primary forest, for example. So it bodes well for active restoration and for lag times when it comes to natural migration, I think.
Thanks, Phil. I have a couple hands that are raised, so we'll go through a couple of people with their hands raised, then we can move back to some of the comments in the chat if we need to. So
Sure.
first, Hugh, I see you have your hand up, so you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, hello. I'm not an ecologist, but one of the things I'm interested in is what you think the core competencies are in the professionals who would be moving from command and control management to holistic ecological stewardship. When I look at the foresters being trained at UBC, a whole bunch of their curriculum is around mensuration and biometrics and with a focus on growth and yield. And that seems a lot less relevant. And many of the other classes they take is a lot less relevant under this. And I'm wondering what you think that looks like or turns into.
Sure. No, I have a couple comments on that issue. You have to think of the history of forestry and its traditional education as being one of exploitation. Okay, the foresters of Quebec are called forest engineers, and that has two meanings to it. One, that you need the engineering skills for building roads and for extracting timber and getting it to the sawmill, but also that you're engineering the next crop of trees. And I think we have to back away and say that the core competency, if you like, should not be that of an engineer. It should be that of an ecologist. Okay, and that may seem self-serving, but I never acquired a professional forester's accreditation strictly on the basis of that belief. Okay, that I am a professional biologist. It's the interaction of species with their environment that is my guideline for suggesting management actions, not the extraction of value and the engineering of an ecosystem. So yeah, I think forestry curricula have a long ways to come to catch up with the idea of ecosystem management and ecosystem stewardship as a guiding principle. And it's not clear everyone's on the same side, though. I mean, this is why we talk about having a divided land base, whether it's a triad system or something much more specialized, in which we recognize that there are still some areas where purely the efficient production of timber, of fiber takes priority. That's a community, a value decision. So long as we do the basic protections that we would expect of agriculture. You protect your water, you protect your soil, you provide some stepping stones for wildlife. But we shouldn't be doing that everywhere anymore, which was the assumption for much of the last century.
But let me add a little thing here, Catherine, and I will ask Phil, you have experience with UBC, UNBC, and maybe other forestry school in the world. Will you say that they have been adapting to the changes, or are they resilient to the changes that the forest and the forestry world are facing?
Yeah, I think both institutions in British Columbia have become more progressive. The problem here is still remains the dominance of the industry. So many students have their summer jobs, and their mentors and supervisors say, "Now let me show you what's really important." And it's all about getting the wood out and doing the minimum to meet government regulations, and not, taking that innovative, careful stewardship approach. But there are good signs on the horizon. There have been several forestry reviews, at least in British Columbia. I just picked up a very useful little booklet here. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Striving for Resilient Ecosystems, put out by the local Woodlot Association. And it talks about all the good things that, we've been discussing, very practical suggestions for the small scale forester, the small scale landowner, which seems to be, the more receptive audience than the big forest companies or the government at the present.
Let me add quickly that Klaus Putman and I receive a few email exchange, and I won't mention the name, but some people were revising an old silvicultural book, and one of the people said the introduction doesn't need to change. It's still relevant today. And the introduction was written in 1996. So I was a bit surprised, I would say, and shocked by this kind of reaction that nothing have changed since 1996.
Well, there's a textbook, I think, even from the 20s or 30s, that talks about a silviculture based on ecological principles. So
That's right.
this recognition has been there for 100 years.
I'm just gonna allow for another question. Charles has his hand raised. So Charles, you can unmute now and ask your question and go ahead.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for the interesting talk, Phil. It's Charles Knock from the University of Alberta. And very interested in that concept of HRV and looking backwards and at our natural models. And I think there's sort of a history of relying on that a bit more heavily in North America because those systems and analogs and examples are perhaps easier to find. So if we kind of contrast, how frequently, this ecosystem management approach or is employed in say Europe versus North America, how do you sort of, think about that contrast? Like, is there some sort of benefit of being less bound to natural models in Europe, where you're able to make choices and not necessarily be bound by what is native as species? Yeah, just have you thought about that a little bit? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's both a strength and a weakness of European foresters that their ancient woodlands are few and far between, that they don't have those natural analogs. But again, if you talk to the ecologist, to the botanist, to the many specialists, there are indicators of what species, based on those few fragments of remaining forest and woodland, are, as to what their composition should be. So I think there's pretty general recognition as to what needs to come back with or without climate change. For example, there's a very strong Caledonian forest restoration movement in Scotland, for example.
Yeah.
There's a very strong movement to enrich spruce plantations with European beech and white fir. It's known that those should be, mixed forest stands, or not have spruce at all because it was overplanted outside of its range. So I think the ecologists know, and I think the silviculturists are talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're a little bit over time. We started a bit late, I know, but I don't want to keep people too long, and we've several people have already had to leave. So I think we'll wrap up there. Unless Phil or Christian, if you have anything last you'd like to reflect on or say, yeah, I'll open it up to you for a second. And
Well, yeah, I had lots of comments, but I want to share something with you, Phil, that is keeping me awake, and I don't know what to do. So maybe you will make me sleep better. But I've read recently that some areas in Canada and Quebec will see more than 70% of its biodiversity being changed and modified over the next 70 years. And because we have lots of exotic species, species are moving, some species will be extinguished, and we're trying to manage trees and forests within an ecosystem that will undergo a major change that has never been undergoing so fast, at least. I mean, and how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this pace of change? The fact that almost all the regulations we have in terms of protected areas assume that everything is static and nothing will change. When everything is dynamic, everything will change. Does it require actually a kind of a major transformation of almost everything we do and practice in our forests?
Yeah, it is very scary. A couple of thoughts in terms of biodiversity impacts. I'm increasingly concerned about exotic species.
Yeah, me too, actually. Even more
Especially
than
those.
climate change in some ways.
Yeah. You know, and I see examples around me of especially the species that can invade undisturbed forests. This is very concerning. You know, whether it's garlic mustard in the east or even around my home in Terrace, the town fathers planted Norway maple everywhere, and the Samaras can disperse into the nearby forest and are doing very well because it is so shade tolerant. The same thing around Vancouver. If you recall, there is English holly and ivy growing into the forest and so forth. So those are concerns. How much to address them? You know, it depends on monitoring. It often depends on volunteers. It depends on legislation and regulations to try and just control it. But at some level, some species will become pervasive. The dandelion is everywhere. We're not going to put it back in the box, you know. In terms of losing species, I think we have to recognize that on a case-by-case basis, they each have their own requirements, and we have to have, you know, some stronger direction and protection at all levels of government, that this is a priority for federal, provincial, municipal government. It should be a priority for all professionals, whether they're biologists or foresters, and realize that some of them are going to depend on saving old forests. Some of them are going to depend on assisted migration to new habitats. Some will depend on open grasslands and meadows. So one has to treat the biodiversity concept increasingly as one that is fine filter rather than coarse filter, because, like you say, the coarse filter static reserves will not capture everything. We have to just continually be monitoring and seeing what's at risk, what can we do about it.
Thank you very much, Phil.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And sorry I didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but if people would like to email me, phil.burton@unbc.ca, I'll try and respond to folks individually. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all.
Yeah, thanks so much, Phil, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you have missed any of our other webinars, or there's anything you want to check back, we record all of these and post them on our YouTube, and that information is available on our website too if you need to find it. So, or give me an email if you're looking for that. So, hope everyone has a great rest of their week, and stay warm in the winter. Take care.
Tell them.
Bye.